Fog swallowed the valley whole, tasting of rusted iron and rotting pine. Somewhere in that gray soup, 3 miles away, a hostile element moved. Watson pressed his face to the spotting scope. "Enemies! At 3,000 meters!" he whispered. Coulter didn't reply. She just unclasped her rifle. Granite bit into Coulter's kneecap through the torn nylon of her combat pants. She shifted her weight, a microscopic adjustment, and her joints crackled in the agonizing silence of the high-altitude ridge. The cold wasn't a temperature up here, it was a physical presence. A dull blade scraping against the back of her neck, searching for a gap between her collar and her tactical scarf. She hated the cold. She hated the way it made her fingers feel thick and stupid, the way it turned the condensation from her own breath into microscopic shards of ice on her eyelashes. But mostly, she hated the waiting. To her left, Dallas Watson lay perfectly still. He was a statue carved from mud and multicam, his eye welded to the rubber cup of the spotting scope. Watson smelled faintly of old garlic, stale adrenaline, and damp wool. It was a human smell, sour and real, grounding her in the miserable reality of their hide site. 2 yards behind them, Akiva Shaw watched their six. Shaw's breathing was a fraction too shallow, a fraction too fast. He was shivering. He was trying to hide it, locking his jaw so his teeth wouldn't chatter, but Coulter could hear the faint, rhythmic friction of his Gore-Tex jacket against the rocks. It annoyed her. Not because he was weak, but because it reminded her that she was shivering too, deep in her core where willpower couldn't reach. They had been on the mountain for 34 hours. No fires, no warm food, no movement larger than a slow roll to relieve the pressure on agonizingly numb limbs. Coulter ran a thumb over the action of her rifle. The metal of the customized 416 chassis was punishingly cold, sucking the heat straight out of her glove. It weighed 28 pounds, a massive, unwieldy beast of a weapon that felt less like a gun and more like a piece of industrial artillery. The sling had spent the last 2 days carving a permanent trench into her right collarbone, right over an old fracture that ached with every drop in barometric pressure. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel like a phantom of the battlefield. She felt like a tired, 32-year-old woman with a bruised shoulder, a bladder that needed emptying, and a lingering headache from the altitude. The fog rolled in thick, damp waves. It wasn't the romantic, ethereal mist of movies. It was a suffocating, heavy blanket that smelled like ozone and wet decay. It clung to the lens of her scope, forcing her to carefully, methodically wipe it away with a microfiber cloth every 20 minutes. If she did it too fast, the movement could be spotted. If she didn't do it at all, she was blind. "Wind's dropping," Watson murmured. His voice was barely a vibration in the dense air, raspy from disuse. Coulter didn't answer immediately. She swallowed, her throat dry and coated in the chalky residue of the antacid she had chewed an hour ago. Nausea was her constant companion before a shot. Her stomach always threatened to rebel, a sharp biological protest against what she was about to do. She wasn't a sociopath. She didn't enjoy pulling the trigger. The people who claimed to enjoy it usually washed out or ended up a liability. Coulter just possessed a terrifyingly compartmentalized mind and a mathematical intuition for ballistics that defied logic. "Reading?" she asked, her voice a flat monotone. "Variable. 3 knots at the muzzle, Cross Valley shear looks like maybe 10, gusting 12. The fog makes it impossible to read the mirage. It's a soup." Watson shifted his weight, his boots making a soft shh sound against the wet earth. "If they come through the pass, we won't see them until they're right on the transition line." Coulter nodded slowly, bringing her eye to the optic. The world shrank to a circular blur of gray and darker gray. She dialed the parallax, her fingers moving with rote, mechanical precision despite the numbness. The reticle swam into focus. It was a grid of hash marks, a mathematical crosshair designed to calculate the exact point where gravity, wind, spin drift, and the Coriolis effect would pull a 400-grain piece of brass and copper over the curvature of the Earth. It was an impossible equation, and she was supposed to solve it in her head, under pressure, while freezing to death. She adjusted her cheek weld. The polymer cheek piece was freezing, biting into the skin of her jaw. She closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the pulse hammering in her temples. "Slow it down," she told herself. "You're just a rest. You're just a bipod made of meat. Stop thinking." But her mind wouldn't stop. It buzzed with the absurdity of their situation. 3 seals left on a godforsaken rock to cover a withdrawal that had happened 12 hours ago. They were the rear guard, the forgotten anchor. Command had told them to expect a trailing hostile force. They hadn't expected the hostile force to be a mechanized platoon, and they certainly hadn't expected the weather to ground all air support. If they were compromised, there was no quick reaction force coming. There was only the long, brutal hike back down the mountain, assuming they survived the first volley of return fire. Shaw shifted behind them, the snap of a small twig sounding like a gunshot in the heavy, wet air. "Hold still, Akiva," Coulter whispered, not looking back. "Legs cramping," Shaw hissed back, his voice tight with pain. "Sorry. Drink some water," quietly. She turned her attention back to the gray expanse. The fog was a living thing, churning and folding in on itself. It played tricks on the eyes. A jagged rock became a helmet. The sway of a dead pine branch became a rifle barrel. Coulter's eyes burned with the strain of staring at nothing. Her retinas felt dry, scraping against her eyelids every time she blinked. She hated the fog. It stole depth perception. It muted sound until a threat was practically standing on your throat. "Got a break in the clouds," Watson noted, his tone shifting imperceptibly from exhausted to hyper-focused. "Wait! Hold on!" Coulter stopped breathing. Her thumb rested lightly on the safety. The freezing metal, the aching shoulder, the nausea, they all retreated, shoved into a dark box in the back of her mind. Sensory input narrowed. There was only the smell of wet earth, the pressure of her finger pad, and the circle of glass in front of her. "I have movement," Watson said. The words were flat, but underneath Coulter heard the spike of adrenaline, deep, very deep. Coulter tracked her scope slowly along the ridgeline that Watson was painting with the spotting scope. She saw nothing but the swirling gray abyss. The distance across the valley was immense, a gaping chasm of dead air and jagged topography. "Give me a landmark," she said softly. "See the Dogtooth Rock Formation, 2 o'clock from the main peak?" "Got it." "Drop down 4 milliradians. There's a cut in the tree line. The fog is thinner there. Thermal is picking up heat blooms." Coulter shifted the massive rifle. The bipod legs dug slightly deeper into the mud. She found the cut. It was a tiny notch in the distant terrain, so far away it looked like a smudge on a painting. She stared through the glass, letting her eyes relax, looking through the image rather than at it. Then she saw it. A faint, rhythmic shifting of the gray. It wasn't a rock. Rocks didn't move with tactical spacing. "I see them," she breathed. Her heart gave a hard, painful thump against her ribs, then settled into a slow, heavy rhythm. The nausea spiked, burning the back of her throat. She forced it down. "Count?" "I'm counting at least 12. No, 15 individuals, moving staggered column. They are heavy. I see mortars, recoilless rifles. They're tracking the primary exfil route." Watson paused, and Coulter heard the faint beep of the laser rangefinder. It failed. The fog scattered the laser. "Lace isn't bouncing back," Watson muttered, frustration bleeding into his whisper. "Too much moisture. I'm going to map it." Coulter waited. She knew Watson was pulling out a laminated topographical map, referencing their known position against the terrain features where the hostiles were moving. It was old-school math, the kind of math that left room for human error. "Distance?" Coulter asked. Watson was silent for 4 long seconds. When he spoke, his voice was different. The professional detachment was fractured, replaced by a quiet, dawning disbelief. "Enemies. At 3,000 meters, he whispered. Coulter didn't reply. She just unclasped her rifle's scope cover and rolled her shoulders. 3,000 meters, 1.86 miles. It was a ridiculous number. It was the kind of distance where the target wasn't a person anymore. It was a theoretical point in space. At that range, the bullet would be in the air for almost 7 seconds. In 7 seconds, a target could stop, tie their shoe, turn around, or just step out of the bullet's path entirely. It meant calculating the rotation of the Earth, because the planet would literally move beneath the bullet while it was in flight. It meant a shot that was 90% luck and 10% godlike precision. Command wants the element leader dropped to stall the advance, Watson read from the encrypted comms tablet, his voice tight. If they get through that pass, they have a direct line of sight on the extraction helicopters down in the basin. Choppers are grounded for another 20 minutes until the weather clears. They're sitting ducks. Who's the leader? Coulter asked. Her hands were moving over the rifle, dialing the elevation turret. Click, click, click. The sound was crisp, mechanical, reassuring. She had to dial the turret almost to its absolute maximum limit. The barrel of the 416 was angled upward like a mortar tube. "Third man in the column," Watson said. "Carrying a radio rig, but he's doing the pointing. The others are orienting on him. Be in the..." Coulter found the third man, a tiny, pixelated smudge of darker gray against the pale fog. He was just a speck. "Wind is a nightmare, Coulter," Watson warned. He was staring at the Kestrel weather meter. "We have a 3-knot tailwind here, but I can see the fog sheer in the valley. We've got a crosswind from the right, probably 15 knots, and an updraft near the target zone. Temperature is 31 degrees, humidity 98%. Barometric pressure is 22.4. Coulter's brain processed the numbers, feeding them into the ballistic solver in her head, cross-referencing them with the dope card taped to her stock. 3,000 meters. Flight time, 6.8 seconds. Elevation, 42 milliradians. Windage, left 6.5 milliradians for the crosswind, minus 0.5 for spindrift. Let's call it left 6. She couldn't stay prone. The angle was too steep. The bipod couldn't elevate the massive rifle enough while keeping her shoulder grounded. The terrain dipped sharply in front of her. "I can't make the angle," she grunted, her voice strained. Grass and rock in the immediate foreground are clipping the line of sight. "What do you want to do?" Watson asked, his hand moving toward his own weapon, ready to provide cover. Coulter didn't answer. Slowly, agonizingly, she rose out of the fog. She pushed herself up from the prone position, her knees screaming in protest, the mud sucking at her boots. She shifted into a high kneeling stance, resting the chassis of the heavy rifle over the jagged edge of a waist-high granite boulder. She was breaking her camouflage. She was exposing her head and shoulders to the open air. The biting wind instantly lashed at her face, stinging her eyes and carrying the scent of pine needles and impending rain. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a dark silhouette against the pale mist. Her breathing hitched for a fraction of a second. Fear, raw and cold, dragged its claws down her spine. If a counter-sniper was looking, she was dead. She ignored it. She pulled the rifle tight into her bruised shoulder pocket. The pain flared, sharp and bright, but she used it. She focused on the pain to anchor her. "Target acquired," she whispered, her cheek glued to the freezing polymer. The crosshairs hovered over empty space, 6 body widths to the left, and several feet above the tiny gray speck moving in the distance. She wasn't aiming at him. She was aiming at a pocket of empty air, trusting the wind and gravity to bring the bullet and the man together in 7 seconds. "Send it when ready," Watson murmured. He wasn't breathing. Coulter closed her eyes. She felt the wind against her damp cheek, memorizing its pressure. She listened to the silence beneath the wind. She let out half a breath, feeling the tension in her diaphragm hold steady. Her finger found the trigger. It was a 2-stage trigger. First, the light take-up. Click. She hovered on the wall. The man in her scope paused. He turned to point at something down the trail. "He's stationary." Coulter's heart beat once. She applied 2 pounds of pressure. The rifle exploded. Gunpowder tasted like burnt pennies and ozone. The blast of the 416 didn't just ring in Coulter's ears. It punched the air out of her lungs and sent a shockwave of displaced fog rolling away from the muzzle brake. Recoil tore backward into her shoulder with the violence of a car crash. Because she was kneeling, unbraced by the earth, the kinetic energy had nowhere to go but directly into her collarbone. The old fracture screamed. Her vision went white for a fraction of a second. She didn't close her bolt. She didn't cycle another round. She just froze, her eye forced back into the scope, fighting the agony in her shoulder to keep the reticle steady on the distant cut in the trees. "Trace," Watson hissed. His voice was entirely different now, stripped of exhaustion, surgical. "I have Trace." Through the spotting scope, Watson was watching the bullet's vapor trail, a tiny swirling disturbance in the air, a corkscrew of displaced atmosphere bending against the crosswinds. 1001. 1002. Coulter's stomach clamped down. The nausea she had been fighting surged upward, hot and acidic. She clenched her jaw, swallowing back bile that tasted like cheap antacids in fear. Down in the valley, the tiny pixelated figures hadn't reacted. Sound travels at a sluggish 1,100 feet per second. The violent crack of her rifle wouldn't reach them for almost 9 seconds. The bullet was traveling 3 times that speed. It was outrunning its own warning. 1004. 1005. Wind is pushing it right, Watson muttered. A tight, mechanical stream of consciousness. Dropping, dropping. Coulter watched the leader. He was still standing there, his arm extended, pointing at whatever phantom threat he thought he saw down the trail. He was entirely unaware that a piece of machined copper, spinning at 300,000 revolutions per minute, was arcing out of the stratosphere directly toward his chest. 1006. The man just folded. There was no cinematic backward throw, no dramatic flailing of limbs. Physics simply intervened. One moment he was a solid object occupying space, the next, all structural integrity vanished. He collapsed straight down into the mud like a puppet whose strings had been violently severed with a pair of shears. Half a second later, the leader's radio operator, standing 2 feet away, flinched violently as the supersonic crack of the bullet passing finally reached him. The man dropped to the dirt, scrambling frantically. "Impact," Watson whispered. The word hung in the freezing air, heavy and blunt. "Center mass. He's gone." Coulter exhaled. It wasn't a sigh of relief. It was a shuddering, broken breath that rattled through her teeth. She pulled her head away from the rifle and immediately retched. A thin stream of yellow bile spilled over the frozen moss next to her boot. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel like a phantom. She felt disgusting. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the bolt handle to eject the spent brass. The brass casing ejected with a sharp clink, smoking hot, melting a tiny hole in the frost where it landed. Down in the valley, the remaining 14 figures were scattering like roaches beneath the kitchen light, but they weren't retreating. Through the glass, Coulter saw 2 of them slamming a heavy metal tube into the dirt, angling it blindly toward the mountain. "Mortars," Shaw barked from behind them, his voice pitched up, cracking with raw panic. "They're setting up a 60mm. "They don't have our elevation," Watson said, already collapsing the legs of his spotting scope with sharp, practiced movements, "but they know the general direction of the gunshot. The echo off these canyon walls is going to walk them right up this ridge." "Pack it up." Coulter grabbed the chassis of her rifle. Her right arm refused to work properly. The muscles around her collarbone were seizing in a massive, involuntary cramp. She hissed through her teeth, grabbing the 28-pound weapon with her left hand and dragging it off the boulder. It was clumsy. It was ugly. The barrel scraped against the granite with a screech that made her wince. "Help her," Watson snapped at Shaw. Shaw scrambled forward, his boots slipping in the mud. He grabbed the rifle by the forend, nearly ripping it out of Coulter's weak grip. I got it, let's go. Come on, Coulter." She didn't argue. Pride was a luxury for people who weren't about to be turned into pink mist by high-explosive indirect fire. She shoved her optics cover down, grabbed her pack, and threw it over her good shoulder. The strap dug into her neck, but she barely felt it over the throbbing agony in her chest. 3 minutes, Watson said, checking his watch. He slung his own weapon and kicked dirt over the warm, smoking brass casing on the ground. "If they're fast, we have 3 minutes before the first ranging shell hits this grid square. Move." Descent was always worse than the climb. Gravity became an active enemy. The mountain, steep and slick with rotting pine needles, fought every step. Coulter's knees, already swollen from 34 hours of motionless kneeling, screamed as they absorbed the shock of her body weight plunging downward. They weren't moving with tactical grace. They were practically falling down the mountain, catching themselves on dead branches and jagged outcroppings. Shaw led, setting a frantic pace. He was breathing too loud, crashing through the brush like a wounded animal. "Slow down, Akiva," Watson warned from the rear, his voice tight. "You break an ankle out here, I'm leaving you." It was a lie, and they all knew it, but the threat was enough to make Shaw check his momentum. Coulter stumbled. Her boot caught on an exposed root, hidden beneath the gray soup of the fog, and she pitched forward. She hit the ground hard, her bad shoulder slamming into the wet earth. Stars exploded in her peripheral vision. A whimper, tiny and pathetic, escaped her lips before she could bite it back. She lay there for a second, her face pressed into the freezing mud. It smelled like worms and decaying wood. Part of her, a dark, exhausted, deeply cynical part of her, just wanted to stay there. The earth was soft. The fog was quiet. If she just closed her eyes, the cold would stop hurting eventually. The military had spent millions of dollars turning her into a machine, teaching her how to calculate spindrift and atmospheric density, but they hadn't found a way to stop her from just being so incredibly tired. A hand grabbed the back of her plate carrier. Watson hauled her up. He He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer words of encouragement. He just dragged her to her feet and shoved her forward. Keep walking. She walked. Thump. The sound was distant, a hollow, metallic cough rolling up from the valley floor. "Tube is hot," Shaw yelled over his shoulder. They all braced instinctively, shoulders hunched, waiting for the shriek of the incoming shell. 10 seconds passed. The silence of the mountain stretched out, taut as piano wire. Crack boom. The mortar shell impacted 200 yards behind them, higher up the ridge. The explosion was deafening, a brutal concussive slap that vibrated right through the soles of Coulter's boots. A shower of splintered wood and pulverized granite rained down through the canopy behind them. "They're firing blind," Watson yelled over the ringing in their ears. "They missed the elevation. Keep moving!" Thump. A second launch. Coulter forced her legs to move faster, sliding down a steep embankment on her heels, using a thick pine trunk to break her descent. Her tactical gloves were shredded, her palms raw and bleeding from gripping rough bark. She could taste the copper in her mouth again. Every breath was a razor blade down her throat. Crack boom. Closer. 100 yards. The shockwave knocked Shaw flat on his stomach. He scrambled back up, spitting dirt, his eyes wide with a terrified feral energy. "We're in the open!" Shaw screamed, gesturing wildly at the terrain ahead. The tree line broke. Before them lay a wide, jagged expanse of scree-loose rock that slanted downward toward the extraction basin. It was a 300-yard sprint across completely exposed ground. The fog was thinner here, shredded by the wind cutting through the lower valley. Thump. "Go, go!" Watson shoved Coulter into the open. She ran. It wasn't a sprint. It was a desperate, stumbling stagger. The loose rocks slid beneath her boots. She surfed the scree, her arms pinwheeling for balance. Her heavy rifle, strapped to Shaw's pack ahead of her, bounced wildly. She felt naked. The gray sky pressed down on her. Any second, the air above her would tear open with high explosives. Crack boom. The third shell hit the tree line they had just abandoned. Dirt and shrapnel pelted Coulter's back like hard rain. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the tree line on the other side of the rock field. Her lungs burned. Her vision narrowed to a tiny, pulsing tunnel. Just as her boots hit the soft earth of the lower tree line, a new sound cut through the chaos. It wasn't an explosion. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping, not metallic, deep and percussive, chopping the air into violent pieces. Helicopters. Through the canopy, a massive, dark shape materialized out of the fog. An MH-60 Pavehawk, hovering 50 feet off the deck, its rotors whipping the mist into a furious hurricane. The side door was open, and a crew chief hung out on a monkey strap, frantically waving them toward the clearing. Shaw broke into a dead sprint, practically throwing himself toward the bird. Watson stopped at the edge of the clearing, turning back. He grabbed Coulter's good arm, pulling her out of the brush and toward the deafening roar of the rotors. They collapsed into the metal belly of the helicopter. The crew chief hauled them in, shouting something Coulter couldn't hear over the engine noise. The deck was covered in hydraulic fluid and spent brass from a previous gun run. It was the most beautiful thing Coulter had ever seen. As the chopper banked hard, lifting violently away from the mountain, Coulter slumped against the vibrating bulkhead. She didn't look out the window. She didn't want to see the mountain anymore. Shaw was sitting across from her, his head between his knees, hyperventilating. Watson was talking to the crew chief, his face a mask of dirt and exhaustion. Coulter looked down at her hands. They were caked in mud, blood, and the freezing gray dirt of the ridge. She slowly reached up and unbuckled her helmet, letting it drop to the floor. Her bruised shoulder throbbed with a sickening rhythm. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the cold metal of the fuselage. She had made the shot. 3,000 meters. A mathematical miracle. A legendary pull of the trigger that would probably be whispered about in the teams for years. She didn't care. She just wanted to be warm. She wanted to scrub the smell of wet decay off her skin, and she wanted to forget the way the man in her scope had simply ceased to be. The helicopter pitched forward, accelerating into the gray sky, carrying 3 ghosts away from a mountain that didn't care if they lived or died. Coulter kept her eyes closed, finally letting herself shiver. The shot is fired, but the impact is miles away. Did Coulter's impossible math hold up against the wind, the fog, and the spin of the earth? The physical toll of the wilderness and the raw reality of survival are just beginning. If you want to see the chaotic aftermath and how Watson and Shaw react when the fog finally lifts, drop a like, share this story with a friend, and hit that subscribe button.